Mr. DeFazio?
I have an amendment at the desk, and I would ask that unanimous consent that...
Without objection, so ordered. The gentleman's recognized.
Okay. Well, what I was going to ask is, sir, is that the manager's amendment actually includes part of this amendment, so I want, I have an amendment at the desk that wouldn't duplicate that portion. So you took care of the problem with 13C in your manager's amendment, so that would be duplicative in this amendment.
Are you withdrawing this amendment?
No. I'm just saying this section of it.
Oh, that section.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, we can pass it again.
Okay.
All right.
Thank you, Mr.
Gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, this goes to an issue that we've dealt with before, and I think we've actually established a very level playing field. Back in starting in the 80s, we provided for private enterprise participation in setting public transit policies and plans, and Safety Lou actually had language to strengthen private enterprise participation in the planning by withholding funds if planning agencies did not meet certain criteria to include the private sector. But however, Safety Lou also had a provision that I think is critical that said that local decision-making, something we've discussed earlier today in other amendments, ultimately, how much to involve the private sector in a local project should be made by the local jurisdictions, not by the federal government. So this amendment would take care of that problem. There are a couple of other issues. Section 2012 says that if an agency contracts out 20% more of its fixed route bus service, they would get a larger federal subsidy for purchasing their buses, which seems to me a bit odd. So we're saying if you mandate privatization of 20% of your routes, we will give you more federal money to privatize or to purchase buses that would be operated by a private operator. So I would strike that section. In fact, over the last decade, the percentage of contracted by local authorities under local jurisdiction with no federal mandate, except to review private bids, but not being forced to accept them, the fixed route bus service in the U.S. has doubled without federal bribes, like this one, going from 80 to 90%, or federal mandates, as in the other section, which I discussed previously. And then finally, this amendment would strike a provision in the bill that makes private entities eligible to directly receive federal grants to purchase rolling stock as subrecipients. Again, local jurisdictions are required to consider the fact that private vendors and there aren't have applied or have a proposal to provide for services locally, but the federal government doesn't provide the rolling stock for those private entities to provide those services. It seems to me a bit antithetical here to say that we're going to use federal tax dollars to purchase buses and give that money directly to private entities to purchase those buses. So I believe that striking these three sections of the bill, in addition to the section that the chairman struck under 13C, would improve the bill, would maintain what we have now, which is a very competitive process with local control, with a level playing field between private and public. And I think that it has worked well with a doubling of the private participation in the last decade, and we shouldn't make these further changes. Thank you, Mr.
Chairman. Other members seek recognition. Mr. Coble.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, first of all, let me say I think we have a...
I don't think we can quite hear you. Is it on? Yeah, it's on.
I wasn't close enough. I'm going to speak in opposition to the gentleman from Oregon's amendment. But let me first of all say, Mr. Chairman, I think we have a well-designed and comprehensive highway reauthorization bill that will create jobs, streamline bridge and road construction, and move our highway infrastructure far beyond the next decade. But I have the opportunity to see the importance of competitive contracting. In my district, the Piedmont Authority Regional Transportation has implemented competitive contracting, resulting in greater savings than the local Guilford County Transportation and the Greensboro Transit. In these tough financial times, when we are asked to do more with less, not only must we support competitive contracting nationwide, I believe we can afford to do otherwise. And yield back.
Other members seek recognition. Mr. Nadler.
Mr. Chairman, I rise to support this amendment. We've had a long history in New York of contracting out of public services, of contracting out of procurement, and sometimes great savings have been realized, and sometimes they've been great boondoggles and scandals have ensued because it turned out the public sector could have done it more cheaply or more efficiently. And that's, I don't know how you generalize that except to say that you have to look at each case, and sometimes it makes sense to do it to privatize, and sometimes it doesn't make sense to do it, and those are judgment calls that local elected and appointed officials make. And certainly if you want to, and we ought to encourage doing things by the most efficient means. But to, in effect, bribe local governments, which this seems to do, by giving them a greater federal aid if they privatize, that's wrong. Because those, again, I thought most people, certainly on that side of the aisle, seem to think that decisions ought to be made locally. We're always talking about states' rights and decisions ought to be made locally. We shouldn't be telling people what to do. So here we're not telling them what to do. We're saying if you do one thing, we'll penalize you. If you do the other thing, we'll give you a greater aid, we'll give you a greater benefit, but make your choice. That's not right. Nor is it right to always assume that the private sector can do it more cheaply or more efficiently than the public sector. Sometimes they can, and sometimes they can't. And those are, we can't judge that from here very often. Locally, they can judge it, and they ought to judge that. And the local electorate should hold public officials accountable for getting the most of the taxpayer's dollar, the most bang for the buck, and that may be by privatizing out some services and by contracting in some services. We shouldn't be telling them what to do, and we shouldn't be giving them a cash bonus for doing it one way or the other. And so I think that this is, we've never done that before so far as I know. I think this is a great step toward centralizing control of decisions that ought to be made locally. It's a great step towards saying that we don't want local governments to make their own decisions. We don't want local governments to provide services on their own. We do want them to contract it out. And as I said, sometimes that makes sense and sometimes it doesn't. But that's not for us to judge because we can't judge that unless you take the ideological position that government is always less efficient than the private sector, which experience shows is not true. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. So this is a very backward section, and I commend the gentleman for his amendment. And I support the amendment. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Others seek recognition on the DeFazio amendment. Then the question occurs, the DeFazio amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed signify by saying no. No.
Mr. Chairman,
have it.
Mr. Chairman, on that, I'd have to ask for a recorded vote.
Asked for a recorded
but I'd
vote.
be happy to roll the vote until later.
No, we're going to take that vote now, and then we'll go on since I've got a lot of members here. Well, again, question occurs on the DeFazio pending amendment. The clerk will call the roll. No, the pin?
Mr. Micah?
No.
Mr. Micah votes no. Mr. Rahal?
Yes. Yes.
Mr. Rahal votes yes. Mr. Altmaier? Mr. Altmaier votes yes. Mr. Barletta? Mr. Barletta votes no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes aye. Mr. Boswell? Mr. Boswell votes yes. Ms. Brown? Ms. Brown votes aye. Dr. Bouchon? Dr. Bouchon votes no. Ms. Capito? Ms. Capito votes no. Mr. Capuano? Mr. Capuano votes aye. Mr. Carnahan? Mr. Carnahan votes aye. Mr. Coble? Mr. Coble votes no. Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen? Mr. Cohen votes aye. Mr. Costello? Mr. Costello votes aye. Mr. Kravac. Mr. Kravac votes nay. Mr. Crawford. Mr. Crawford votes no. Mr. Cummings. Mr. Cummings votes aye. Mr. DeFazio.
Aye.
Mr. DeFazio votes aye. Mr. Denham. Mr. Denham votes no. Mr. Duncan. Mr. Duncan votes no. Ms. Edwards. Ms. Edwards votes aye.
Yeah,
Mr. Farenthold.
Like to.
Mr. Farenthold votes no. Mr. Filner. Mr. Fleischman. Mr. Fleischman votes no. Mr. Gibbs. Mr. Gibbs votes no. Mr. Graves. Mr. Graves votes no. Mr. Ginta. Mr. Ginta votes no. Mr. Hanna. Mr. Hanna votes no. Dr. Harris. Mrs. Herrera Butler. Mrs. Herrera Butler votes no. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono votes aye. Mr. Holden. Mr. Holden. Mr. Holtgren. Mr. Holtgren votes no. Mr. Hunter. Mr. Hunter votes no. Mr. Johnson. Ms. Johnson. Ms. Johnson votes aye. Mr. Landry. Mr. Langford. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson votes yes. Mr. Lipinski. Mr. Lipinski votes aye. Mr. Lobiondo. Mr. Lobiondo votes aye. Mr. Long. Mr. Long votes no. Mr. Meehan. Mr. Meehan votes no. Mr. Michaud. Mr. Michaud votes aye. Mr. Miller. Mr. Miller votes no. Ms. Miller. Ms. Miller votes no. Mr. Nadler. Mr. Nadler votes aye. Mrs. Napolitano. Mrs. Napolitano votes aye. Ms. Norton. Mr. Petri.
No.
Mr. Petri votes no. Mr. Ribble. Mr. Ribble votes no. Ms. Richardson. Ms. Richardson votes aye. Ms. Schmidt. Ms. Schmidt votes no. Mr. Schuler. Mr. Schuster. Mr. Schuster votes no. Mr. Sears. Mr. Sutherland. Mr. Sutherland votes no. Mr. Walls. Mr. Walls votes aye. Mr. Young.
So Lipinski has one. Have all members been recorded? I'm sorry, Ms. Norton?
Ms. Norton
Mr.
votes
Landry?
yes. Mr. Landry. Mr. Landry votes no.
Mr. Langford?
Mr. Langford is not recorded. Mr. Langford votes no.
Other members seek to have their vote recorded. Okay, the clerk will report.
On this votes, the yeas are 23, the nays are 29. The amendment is not agreed to.
Amendment's not agreed to. The next order of